Okay, in Acts chapter 10, I'm going to begin reading at verse 1. It's such a long passage, and I'm not going to get into chapter 11 at all. I'm even going to only read a portion of chapter 10 today. I'm going to start at verse 1. At Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion in what was known as the Italian regiment. He and all his family were devout and God-fearing. He gave generously to those in need and prayed to God regularly. Okay, let me pause for a moment. This man is very important. He is a Roman soldier. He's been stationed from Rome in Israel. And somehow or another, we find out from this passage of Scripture that he'd come to believe that there was just one God. He started praying to him. He started listening for him. He hadn't become Jewish. He hadn't converted. He hadn't become one of God's people, but he had the sense there's just this one God, and we should serve him. And anyway, verse 3. One day at about 3 p.m, he had a vision. He distinctly saw an angel of God who came to him and said, "Cornelius." Cornelius stared at him in fear. "What is it, Lord?" he asked. The angel answered, "Your prayers and gifts to the poor have come up as a memorial offering before God. Now send men to Joppa to bring back a man named Simon, who is called Peter. He is staying with Simon the tanner, whose house is by the sea." When the angel who spoke to him had gone, Cornelius called 2 of his servants and a devout soldier who was one of his attendants. He told them everything that had happened and sent them to Joppa. Now, about noon the following day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up on the roof to pray. He became hungry and wanted something to eat, and while the meal was being prepared, he fell into a trance. He saw heaven open and something like a large sheet being let down to earth by its 4 corners, contained all kinds of 4-footed animals, as well as reptiles and birds. Then a voice told him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." "Surely not, Lord," Peter replied. "I have never eaten anything impure or unclean." The voice spoke to him a second time. "Do not call anything impure that God has made clean." This happened 3 times, and immediately the sheet was taken back to heaven. So, okay, pause just for a moment. There's this unbelievably strange vision where Peter, as he's praying at noon, waiting for lunch, this sheet comes down out of heaven, and somehow in the sheet there's all kinds of animals, and there's a voice that says, "All right, get up, kill and eat them." And Peter is he's aghast. These aren't the kinds of things that he would ever eat, and he says, "No, I can't do that." And the voice says, "Don't you call anything impure that I've called clean." And then apparently he has this vision a second time, and then apparently he has this vision a third time. And of course, if you have a vision like that, you're just left perplexed and wondering, what is that all about? All right, we'll pick it up in verse 17. While Peter was wondering about the meaning of the vision, the men sent by Cornelius found out where Simon's house was and stopped at the gate. They called out, asking if Simon, who was known as Peter, was staying there. While Peter was still thinking about the vision, the Spirit said to him, "Simon, 3 men are looking for you. So get up and go downstairs. Do not hesitate to go with them, for I have sent them." Peter went down and said to the men, "I'm the one you're looking for. Why have you come?" The men replied, "We have come from Cornelius the centurion. He's a righteous and God-fearing man who's respected by all the Jewish people. A holy angel told him to ask you to come to his house so that he could hear what you have to say." Then Peter invited the men into the house to be his guests. The next day, Peter started out with them, and some of the believers from Joppa went along. The following day, he arrived in Caesarea. Cornelius was expecting them and had called together his relatives and close friends. As Peter entered the house, Cornelius met him and fell at his feet in reverence. But Peter made him get up. "Stand up," he said. "I'm only a man myself." While talking with him, Peter went inside and found a large gathering of people. He said to them, "You are all well aware that it is against our law for a Jew to associate with or even visit a Gentile. But God has shown me that I should not call anyone impure or unclean. So when I was sent for, I came without raising any objection." We'll pause there. Cornelius then relays to Peter the vision that he had had. I'll pick up in verse 34. "Then Peter began to speak. I now realize how true it is that God does not show favoritism, but accepts from every nation the one who fears him and does what is right. You know the message God sent to the people of Israel, announcing the good news of peace through Jesus Christ, who is Lord of all." And that's as much as we're going to read today. Now, here's what happens. Two men get a vision. First, Cornelius. He's been stationed in Israel. He's come to think there's just one God. He's become a generous person. He started praying, and all of a sudden, God sends him this vision where an angel shows up and basically says, "You've got to send for Simon Peter, who's one of the apostles." He ends up sending some servants along with a soldier to go down to Joppa. They're going to go get Peter. On noon that next day, Peter is actually up on the roof. It's lunchtime. He's getting hungry. And while the meal's being prepared, he falls into this trance and he has a vision. And in this vision, as we mentioned, there's this like a sheet that comes down from heaven, and inside this sheet there's all kinds of animals, and he's instructed, "Get up, kill, and eat it." And he's like, "Oh, gross, I couldn't eat any of that. That stuff's unclean, and I'd never, eat that stuff." And God says to him, "Don't you call anything unclean that I've called clean." And while he's thinking of it, he does that 3 times. He's thinking, what in the world is that all about? These men arrive. They explain that they've come from Cornelius. Peter goes back with them, and he has the opportunity now to present and share the gospel message, the good news of Jesus Christ, not only to Cornelius, but to this Gentile audience. And again, this is only part 1 of 2 parts, this week and next. But what's going on here? What are these 2 visions about? What is this vision about this food? And what is it that the church has to wrestle with? In order to answer those questions, we've got to, as I mentioned, take a swim in the deep end and talk about, of all things, the book of Leviticus. And I don't know if you've ever taken the time to really read through Leviticus. It's not easy. It's tough reading. But in chapter 11, there is this entire chapter that's about the food laws for God's people. They're dietary restrictions, so to speak. You could turn there or you could just listen in. I'm going to put the verses on the screen as we go. This is not, it's detailed, so here's what I'm going to do. First, I'm going to give you the data. Then, once we know what chapter 11 of the book of Leviticus says, we'll try to draw some conclusions. What is that all about? And then, what are the implications for my life? So, all right, let's just start with the data. If you open up the book of Leviticus, you read chapter 11, here's what you find. There are some things God's people could eat, they were clean. Some things they could not eat, they're unclean, and if you eat them, you'll become unclean. Let's start with the animals that live on earth. So if you were reading in Leviticus chapter 11, verses 2 and 3 say this: "Of all the animals that live on the land, these are the ones you may eat. You may eat any animal that has a divided hoof and that chews the cud." So, okay, you've got to kind of make a distinction, distinguish between the animals. You may eat the ones that have 2 things, a divided hoof and chews the cud. So here's some pictures of animals. You've got a pig there, you've got a dog, you've got a horse, you've got a camel. And it turns out that, like a dog, what does a dog have? It has paws. Okay, don't eat. Off limits. You guys are like, no dog. No cat, Pigs, they have a divided hoof, but they don't chew the cud. They don't ruminate. They don't keep eating. Those are off limits. Those are all forbidden. But you've got other animals that sort of walk the earth. You've got the cow, you've got the goat, you've got the sheep, you've got deer, and they fit the bill. Have at it. Roast them up, have a barbecue, invite friends over, those are good to go, they're clean. You can have those. That's the instructions about animals. Okay, but it's not just things that live on land. What about the things that live in the sea? So verse 9 gives us sort of the restrictions. And of course, there's more detail. You can read it on your own in chapter 11. I'm giving the outline here. Of all the creatures living in the waters of the seas and the streams, you may eat any that have fins and scales. Has fins and scales, good to go. Lacking fins, lacking scales, stay away. So, okay, here we go. Well, let's see here. John, I think I need your help here. There we go. There's a whole bunch of stuff that lives in the ocean that does not have fins and scales. Lobsters, shrimp, turtles, crabs, clams. Generally, things that have fins and scales are sort of able to fight the current. Maybe that's a way of putting it. Things that don't often are kind of carried along by the current. Anyway, next slide. Those are things that are absolutely forbidden. Stay away. They're unclean. They'll make you unclean. But next slide. There's all kinds of, bass, trout. They have fins and scales. You catch them, fillet them up. They're good to go. Invite your friends. You may eat them. That's part of the diet. All right, but beyond just things that live on the land or live in the seas, there's also birds. Now, I didn't take the time as I kind of arranged all this to go through all the birds you can't eat. There's a ... at the end. But here's what it says. These are the birds you are to regard as unclean and not eat because they're unclean. And then there's a long list. I don't list them all. There's the eagle, the vulture, the black vulture, the red kite, and so on and so forth. You've got the owl, you've got the pelican. Anyway, next slide for me here. The bat. Probably you're happy to see the bat on that side of the screen. These things, next slide, are all forbidden. And probably the reason why, you can take a look at the list yourself. It tends to be that all the birds on this side of the list, they're sort of like vultures. They wait around for something dead, and then they prey on that dead thing. And we'll find out later that everything that's dead is automatically unclean, and so probably because they touch something unclean, they become unclean. And so now, don't eat them. Stay away. Not good for you. No bat soup for you tonight. But next slide. Good news. You've got the chicken. You've got the duck. You've got the turkey. You've got the peacock. Have wings. Good to go. You may eat. Okay, but it's not only, there's lots of other kinds of food besides animals and fish and birds. What about the insects? Right? So all flying insects that walk on all four are to be regarded as unclean by you. Whew, good, right? However, there are some flying insects that walk on all fours that you may eat. Oh, they're the ones that have jointed legs for hopping on the ground. And so here we go. I've got it back. Have at the grasshopper all day long. You see them, catch them. I don't know. Do you fry them with oil? Do they pop? I'm not quite sure what they do. But apparently, go to town. Those ones are clean. The other insects, all unclean. And then, beyond insects, and this is just another category. It's like the stuff that just squirms around on the ground. We've got this statement: every creature that moves along the ground is to be regarded as unclean, not to be eaten. You are not to eat any creature that moves along the ground, whether it moves on its belly or walks on all four or on many feet. It's unclean. And so, no frog stew, no lizards. Don't go chasing the geckos. You can't have at them. Mice, snail, snakes. Can't eat the snakes. Those are all kind of off. They're off limits. And all right, more or less, those are the basic facts that we find in Leviticus chapter 11. There's some more facts. I'll call these sort of the supplementary facts about Leviticus 11. You can read this on your own later if you want to, but you just need to know these things. Here, I want to show you Leviticus 11:13. It's not as clear in the NIV, but very clear in the New American Standard Version. It's not just that you shouldn't eat them, but God wanted his people to kind of have a visceral reaction. He says, "These, moreover, you shall detest. They're abhorrent, not to be eaten." I mean, it's almost like you should gag when you think about it. Can I tell you a story? So many of you know my wife and I were missionaries in Nigeria. And of course, while we were there, we were introduced to all kinds of foods like you can't even imagine. And we consumed things that, frankly, most people wouldn't. I don't know what even convinced us to. But there was a place where we drew the line. Here's what it was. Where we lived, we actually had on our house, we had a little solar panel just outside the house. That solar panel charged up like a car battery. And then at nighttime, we had this light bulb up in the ceiling that we could turn on that was fueled by this car battery. It was a little solar light, and so at night we'd have light. And you can just imagine, because we were the only ones for miles and miles and miles around that had a light bulb at night, what would happen? Bugs, right? Get attracted to the light. And we had these screens outside our windows. Our windows weren't totally all the way shut. There was always air coming through. But at any rate, I'll never forget this. It was just a season. It was very short, where for whatever reason at that time of the year, there were these flying beetles that just, I don't know, they came into season, so to speak. Right? And because we were the only light bulb for miles around, guess where they came? And so at night, we started hearing thud, 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 thud against our windows. And it was like the carnival came to town, because the kids of the village surrounded our house, and every time thud and then hit the ground, they would pick it up, tear the wings off, tear off the feet, and then ugh. Okay, that, I drew the line. All right, that reaction that we have where it's just the thought of this insect, no. It wasn't just you couldn't eat them. You needed to detest it, ugh, gross. Stay away from me. All right, supplemental fact number 2. I already mentioned this earlier. It says, whoever touches carcasses will be unclean. And this is a principle you find in Leviticus 11. You may not touch a dead animal. So it doesn't matter whether the animal is part of the clean category or the unclean category. If it was already dead, you can't even touch it. If you touch it, you become unclean. And this entire principle, it becomes actually, anything unclean can make you unclean. And I would just, here, supplementary fact number 3. If any one of them falls into a clay pot, everything in it will be unclean, and you must break the clay pot. So if there's unclean food, whether that came from a dead body or was it just from one of those forbidden animals, and that unclean food touched a dish, like a clay pot, from then on, that clay pot's unclean. Anything you eat from it's unclean, and you become unclean. So what's it say? You have to break it. And not only that, but look at this next part. Anything that one of the carcasses falls on becomes unclean. So an oven or a cooking pot that something unclean was in must be broken up. They're unclean. What does that mean? It means that if any unclean food ever is cooked by your oven, all clean food from then on becomes unclean because it touches your oven. Or if there's a pot that at one point was clean, but some unclean thing touched that pot's now unclean, and anything you cook in it, even if it's the good food, is now unclean, and if you eat from it, you'll become unclean. Final kind of supplementary fact. This is the ground, or the reason, or the rationale behind all of it. God says, I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I'm holy. Holy means set apart, different, unique, special. The opposite of holy is common or ordinary or everyday. And God says, listen, don't be just like everyone else. Be special, be different, stand out, be set apart, because I'm special, I'm different, I stand out. And that's the reason that you follow these commands. Okay. Everyone still feeling good? All right, no one's drowning in the deep end. We're feeling good? That's the data. Now, what are some conclusions? What are we supposed to learn from this? What is this all about? All right, 1, 2, 3, I think 4 things. Number 1, cultural distinctiveness and holiness. God did not want his people having fellowship with the surrounding peoples. Let's talk about cultural distinctiveness first. So God's people had been slaves in Egypt. They were basically Egyptian. He takes them out of there. He wants them to be a cohesive unit with their own culture, with their own food, with their own... Here, let's try this. I'll name some foods. You name the culture. Ready? All right. Pasta. Spaghetti. No, you got to wait. Don't just shout it. I'll say 1, 2, 3. So pasta, spaghetti, pizza. 1, 2, 3. All right. Tacos, tortillas, enchiladas, burritos. 1, 2, 3. All right, rice and beans. 1, 2, 3. All right, there's lots of different cultures, maybe the rice and beans. Here, let's try this one. Big Mac, large fries, milkshake. 1, 2, 3. Okay, right? Every people group has its own unique foods. And God wanted his people to be a cohesive culture, to kind of cohere and stick together. And so they had their own foods, things they ate, things that they thought, man, that's gross. That was part of it, but it's more than that. As you read through the Old Testament, the number 1 temptation that God's people were always falling into is idolatry. Running after the gods of other nations. And as a result, God did everything he could to keep his people separate. Now I want you to think about this. How difficult it would be to go to a Gentile's house and have food. All right, hey, want to come over to my house? Sure, what you having? Well, let's have some bacon and ham. Ugh, gross, no thanks, right? But, okay, fine. We'll keep the ham for later. We'll have some beef. Well, let me ask you a question. Have you ever cooked anything unclean in your oven? Yeah? Well, then the beef would be unclean. Gross. Ugh. Stay away. For someone who followed these laws perfectly, can you imagine how... Could you go out to a restaurant? I mean, no way. It'd be virtually impossible. And to have a meal with someone is to have fellowship with them. And God, he didn't want his people becoming kind of syncretistic and becoming like the other nations. He wanted them to be different, to be special, to stand out. And so, at least that's one reason, one of the big reasons for these food laws. Number 2, all these food laws were a reminder of the real problem, which was sin. What is sin? Disobeying God's commands. Let's go right back to the very beginning. In the Garden of Eden, God had set up this garden, and he gave people all the food to eat there, except for one commandment. You remember it? Genesis 2:17. You must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That was the only command that God gave. Don't do that. And there was nothing in the fruit in and of itself that was evil. It was just, would they follow God's commands or wouldn't they? And, of course, we know the outcome. We human beings, filled with pride, we would not follow God's commands. They ate of the fruit of that tree, and now here's another set of commands about food. Eat this, not that. Will you do it or won't you? And it's really, every time there's a commandment, eat this, not that, it's a reminder that, oh, that's right, I've got a problem in here. My heart's become corrupt. It's been filled with pride. I've wanted to do things my way. Third kind of conclusion. If you read through these food laws, and by the way, the rest of Leviticus, you will discover that it was basically impossible to remain clean. So in addition to these food laws, and now you just think about this, not only like you separate all these animals, you make sure that all your pots and pans are goods, but I mean, someone offers you food, I mean, it'd be so easy, you don't even know. But in addition to the food laws, you read through Leviticus, I mean, it's surprising. In addition to food laws, do you realize there's all kinds of sicknesses that make you unclean? You realize that if you just got a rash, you were unclean? Death. We talked about that. I mean, you come in contact with anything or anyone who's dead. You can't even touch whatever that is. There's a fly buzzing around you. Squat. Oh, I'm unclean. I mean, just think about this. Blood. I mean, I don't know. How about you? Sometimes I have a scratch, and I pick off a scab, and I start to bleed. Guess what? I touch blood. I'm unclean. I mean, anyone here never bled before? What does that mean? You have been unclean, according to the book of Leviticus. Childbirth, molds or mildews you come in contact with, clothing. You know, if you wear polyester, mixed clothing, where you have two different kinds of threads, you're unclean. All kinds of common bodily discharges make you unclean. There's a whole long list, ... right? And here's the message. It is basically impossible for you to remain clean. And as sort of a new yearning, I think these words of David have to then become the yearning of your heart. Clean me up, God. Wash away all my iniquity and cleanse me from sin. Cleanse me with hyssop, and I'll be clean. Wash me, and I'll be whiter than snow. I mean, because obviously I can't stay clean. I need somebody to clean me up, and so that becomes the yearning of my heart. And now, if you really think about what the Old Testament means, there's a way of saying this, that all the Old Testament is like the shadow leading to the reality of the New Testament. Like, imagine if there's a light behind me and I'm walking toward you. What would first arrive to you is my shadow, and then eventually I'd arrive. When you saw my shadow, you'd see the outlines of everything, but once I'm there, you'd see the reality of me. And maybe that's the way to think of the Old Testament. The Old Testament was leaning to Christ, and in the Old Testament we got the shadow, but in Christ we get the reality. And let's just talk our way through this. So in the movement from the Old Testament to the New Testament, it becomes clear that holiness is really not about externals, stuff outside, but here. Remember, what's the true problem? The true problem is sin and what's inside. And here, I'm just going to give you an example. Jesus talked about these food laws in Mark chapter 7. Here's what he said. He said, "Don't you see that nothing that enters a person from the outside can defile them? For it doesn't go into their heart, but into their stomach and then out of the body." And then Mark says, now in saying this, Jesus declared all foods were clean. This passage goes on. Jesus continues to say, what comes out of a person defiles them, for it's from within, out of the person's heart, that evil thoughts come. Then he names them: sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. He says all these evils come from inside, and that's what makes a person unclean. In other words, all these laws and regulations, they were pointing to something. They were pointing back to the real problem. They were pointing forward to the real solution. They weren't an end in and of himself. And Jesus, he actually says, listen, from here on out, I declare all foods are clean. We'll come back to that. All right, here's the most important thing I'm going to say all day. So if you haven't been listening, tune back in. Here it is. As soon as I'm done, feel free to tune back out. This is the most important thing I'm going to say. For something dirty to become clean, something clean must become undirty. Here, look at this. My right hand's dirty. How do I get it clean? Well, usually I take my left hand, and what do I have to do? What happens? Or I take water, and I put my hands under the water. What's the water look like down in the sink? In order for something dirty to become clean, something clean must become dirty. Remember, one of the points was, you're dirty. Don't you see it? You're not clean. And the yearning is, God, please clean me up. Now, what's the gospel? The gospel is we, because we're dirty, can't, just by following externals, get what's in here clean. So what happened? God himself entered into our reality, pure, holy, clean. And that something clean had to get dirty. I talk about the cross every Sunday. If you're here, you realize that. Why? It's so profound what happened. I want you to think about this cross. All right, anyone remember, what is the name of the place where the cross of Jesus stood? Remember it? The skull, Golgotha. Now, what's a skull? It's a head that's now, presumably dead. Right? Why was it called the skull? Probably because it was a place of bones and death. What happens if you touch something dead? You become what? Something clean was getting dirty. Now I want you to think about the nails piercing his hands and feet. Remember what I said? I pick a scab off, I start to bleed. What am I now? I'm unclean. What happened to Jesus? You just think about the blood pouring out of those holes. What was he? This is what was happening. God was taking my true uncleanness off of me, and he was putting it on Jesus. In order for something dirty to become clean, something clean had to get dirty. And that's the message of the Bible, that the God of the universe entered our reality to clean us up. And I'd just like to say this. There's any number of us who are sitting here today who, you just existentially know it. I feel dirty. I'm corrupt. I don't live up to God's standard. I'm dirty. There's no external manipulation of that. You need something clean to enter in and clean you up, and that's why the gospel is so important. Okay, 3 implications of this teaching. I'm going to take one at a time, some shorter, some longer. The first one's shorter. Implication number 1 has to actually do with the Bible. So, I hear this all the time now. People are saying these kind of accusations against Christians. Here's what they say. They say, listen, Christians just pick and choose from the Bible. They kind of pick out the commands they like, and they disregard the commands they don't like. And so they'll say things like this. Well, why do Christians choose this command from the Bible, but I see them eating lobster? Or they'll say, Christians choose out these commands, but I see them wearing polyester. Ooh. Right? And I want you to know this. The whole Bible, if you're a Christian, the whole Bible is the Word of God. Everything it says, we accept, we trust, we believe. Now, in the case of Leviticus, there were commands that at one time were for God's people, but now God, who at one time commanded these animals are unclean, later said, they're clean. Go ahead, eat them. And that's the reason why, go home and have a hot dog. Grill up some shrimp on the Barbie. Have at it, turtle soup, whatever you like. Why? Because the Bible says it. Not just because, I don't like that. No, Christians don't go through the Bible and say, I don't like this, take it out. We follow the whole Bible, every word. All right, that's it. Number 2, missions. So a couple of quick things here. Number 1, I've already told you this. Every culture has different foods. And do you know this? That every major religion in the world has dietary laws except one, Christianity. So if you're Buddhist or Hindu, you're basically a vegetarian. If you're Muslim, the pig is totally off limit, as well as a whole bunch of other foods. If you're Sikh, whatever, there's what you can eat and what you can't. Do you know Christians alone, there's no dietary laws. What does that mean? It means that I can share a meal with anyone from any culture. And I'll tell you something, as a missionary, I kind of have. And you know what that means? It means that we can have fellowship together. It means there's no one excluded. There's people all around the world. They eat all kinds of different things. And guess what? As Christians, you're welcome. We can have fellowship with one another. You're totally welcome. And number 2, I made this statement: in order for something to be clean, something must become dirty. But now, guess what's happened? Because of the gospel, we've become cleaned on the inside. Now, if we're cleaned on the inside, do we need to worry about other people's external dirtiness? No, not at all. Not at all. In fact, Christians, instead of being called apart from the world, like, I better not get too close to those people, guess what? We are called, just like Jesus now, to go and get our hands dirty. There's people doing all kinds of things that are gross and disgusting or whatever. As Christians, do you need to run from those people? Not at all. You are clean. They can't make you dirty. You're called to bring the cleanness of Jesus to other people. And this is really what Peter figured out. I mean, you read through this chapter, he shows up to Cornelius, and you even see it in verse 28. He says, listen, you are well aware that it is against our law for a Jew to associate with or even visit a Gentile. He says, in the past, we haven't been able to come here. But now I see, he says, that anything that God calls clean, I'm not to call unclean. No one is off limits for Christians. Number 3, and this is the third one, holiness. Now, I don't want to give you the impression, nor do I want you to think, that in light of Christ, we're not called to be holy. We are absolutely called to be holy. What does that mean? We're supposed to be set apart, different, special. We're not supposed to be like the rest of the world. But it's no longer about externals. It's about what's in here. And so I'd like to just, as I end, talk about this verse from Philippians chapter 2. Paul writes to Christians who have been changed by the gospel inside out, and he says, become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. You see how he describes the world, warped and crooked. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky as you hold firmly to the word of life. I love that imagery, shining like stars. If you look up at the night sky and see the stars, what color is the night sky? It's dark. But standing out in contrast, and in a compelling way, and those two words I think are important. In contrast, we're supposed to be different, but there's supposed to be something compelling or attractive about us. We stand out. So here, this is my list. Crooked and depraved generation. I think this list sort of describes, maybe, would you agree this list describes our culture? Our culture is one of immediate gratification. We need it right now. Right now. I can't wait, I need it now. Our culture is one of pessimism and tearing others down. In fact, I would say this, most people don't even think there's a way to get ahead unless I tear someone else down. Our culture is promiscuous, it's sex-saturated. I mean, sex is everywhere in our culture. It's pleasure-seeking and amusement. It's like I need a thrill right now. In order for me to be happy, something's got to be sort of thrilling me. Our culture's superficial. It's apathetic. It's indifferent. Our culture says, you know what? Just don't think about it. Just, come on, just live your life. Just party it up. Just don't think. Our culture is grudge-holding, revenge-seeking, and violent. Our culture's arrogant and self-interested, which is another way of saying, you know what, who we're about me, me, me. I would say that's our world. Are we supposed to just blend in, be like them? Should we live our lives that way? Well, that's what everyone else is doing, so let me just sort of see if I can fit in here. No. We're still supposed to be called holy, but it's not external things like what do I eat or what do I wear. It's a matter of the heart, the quality of who I am. And so, okay, here's my next list. Instead of just now, I need it now, Christians are supposed to practice patient hope. You know what? I don't need it right now. If it's not going to come now, that's fine. I'll just be patient and wait on God. Instead of being pessimistic, tearing others down, we're supposed to encourage other people and build others up. We're supposed to make other people feel like they're special and build them up and show them who they are in light of who God is. Instead of being promiscuous and sex-saturated, we're supposed to practice self-control and have marital fidelity. Instead of pleasure-seeking and amusement, instead of just going from one thrill to the next, you know that we now, because we've been changed, we've been purified, we've become clean, we can have lives of purpose. And joy. You know, joy is special because it transcends our circumstances. Everything can be falling apart and you can still have joy. That's so much better than just needing the next thrill. Instead of being superficial and apathetic and indifferent, Christians are supposed to seek what's deep and substantial. Don't let anyone tell you, don't think about it. Just, don't think about it. Think about it. Why am I here? What's the meaning of life? Who is God? Don't just float around and not think about these important things. Instead of being grudge-holding, revenge-seeking, violent, we're supposed to love. We're supposed to show mercy, forgive, have compassion, promote peace. Instead of trying to divide everyone all the time, we're different. Instead of being arrogant and self-interested, we're supposed to be special, set apart, totally different than the world. Instead of putting me first, I put others first. Instead of loving myself, I consider others better than myself. This is what the gospel can do. It's not just a change of the externals. Because Jesus came, he changes us from the inside out. He cleans us up. And now we're called to be holy and different and set apart and special. And it's not just difference for difference sake. It's attractive. And this is what should happen, because here's what we do. We're not standing apart from the world. We're plunging in. Why? Because it takes something clean to make something dirty clean, right? We're plunging in. We're getting in there. We're getting our hands dirty. And yet we're not becoming dirty ourselves. We're standing apart. We're living differently. And as we do, you know what, people, what's your deal? Why do you live like that? And boy, there's something compelling there. I sure would like it. What is it? And that gives us the opportunity to tell them about the one who came to make the unclean one clean. And that's our charge as Christians. Let's pray together.